Corporate greed has a body count no one talks about. It's not about cutting corners on quality, it's about a known fatal flaw in a brand new jetliner, a flaw an engineer predicted would eliminate hundreds. The company knew, the government knew, but they chose a cheap fix and a secret agreement over saving lives. So how did a piece of paper, a memo filed away in a cabinet, become the smoking gun for one of aviation's deadliest cover-ups? On June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 was climbing out of Detroit. On board the new McDonnell Douglas DC-10, 67 passengers and crew were settling in for a routine flight to Buffalo, but as the jet passed through 11,750 feet over Windsor, Ontario, a sudden, violent thud rocked the cockpit. The cabin floor behind the pilots buckled and collapsed, filling the air with dust and debris. This was the first time the DC-10's fatal secret would reveal itself. The aft cargo door had blown clean off the fuselage. The sudden, explosive decompression of the cargo hold created a massive pressure difference with the passenger cabin above. The cabin floor, never designed to withstand such a force and lacking proper vents, gave way. The collapse severed or jammed critical flight control cables running to the tail. The pilots, led by the experienced Captain Bryce McCormick, were suddenly fighting a crippled beast. The rudder was jammed hard to the right, and the tail-mounted No. 2 engine was dead. In an incredible display of airmanship, McCormick used asymmetric thrust from the two remaining wing-mounted engines to steer the plane, wrestling it back towards Detroit for an emergency landing. Miraculously, everyone survived. The incident was a perfect, bloodless dress rehearsal for a future catastrophe. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation was swift. They found the cargo door miles from the airport and concluded its locking mechanism was fundamentally flawed. They issued urgent recommendations. The door needed a mandatory redesign, and just as critically, vents needed to be cut into the cabin floors of all DC-10s to prevent a future collapse. The warning shot had been fired, but while the industry now knew the DC-10 had a design flaw that could bring it down, the real question was, what would they do about it? The problem with the DC-10 started with a fundamental design choice. For passenger doors, airlines use what's called a plug door. It opens inward and is slightly larger than the hole it fills. When the cabin pressurizes, the air pressure itself pushes the door into its frame, creating a perfect fail-safe seal. But for the massive cargo doors, McDonnell Douglas wanted to maximize space, so they designed them to open outward. This meant the door had to be held shut against tons of force by a complex mechanical latching system. It was a choice that prioritized cargo volume over inherent safety, and it created a system riddled with vulnerabilities. The mechanism was a cascade of failures waiting to happen. An electric motor was supposed to rotate a series of C-shaped hooks that grabbed onto pins on the fuselage, but the mechanism was weak. The parts could bend, preventing the hooks from rotating all the way into a securely locked over-center position. As a backup, a ground handler would close a manual locking handle on the outside of the door, which was supposed to drive solid metal pins through the hooks, physically locking them in place. But again, the linkage was so flimsy that if the pins didn't line up, a handler could simply force the handle shut, bending the linkage and giving the appearance of a locked door when it was anything but. There was even a third layer of defense, a small vent door designed to stay open if the pins weren't locked, preventing the plane from pressurizing. But this vent door was connected to the same weak handle linkage. Forcing the main handle also forced the vent door shut, defeating the safeguard entirely. To top it all off, the cockpit warning light meant to tell the pilots the door was unlocked was connected to the handle's movement, not the actual locking pins. When a handler forced the handle shut, the light in the cockpit went out, giving the flight crew a false sense of security. Every single layer of safety could be systematically and unknowingly defeated by a single baggage handler doing their job. Compounding this mechanical mess was the catastrophic structural flaw, the cabin floor. It had no vents. In the event of a cargo hold decompression, the floor was guaranteed to collapse. And in an act of staggering engineering negligence, McDonnell Douglas routed all the primary and backup flight control cables for the elevator, rudder, and tail engine directly through the beams of this incredibly vulnerable flaw. This created a single point of failure where losing a cargo door would immediately lead to a total total and irreversible loss of control. The DC-10 didn't just have a faulty door, it had a fundamentally flawed architecture that made a survivable emergency almost impossible. The most damning indictment of the DC-10 disaster didn't come from investigators after the crash. It came from an engineer 2 years before it happened in a memo that was deliberately buried. His name was Dan Applegate. He was the director of product engineering at Convair, the subcontractor that built the DC-10's fuselage and its deadly cargo doors. Just 15 days after the Windsor incident with American Airlines Flight 96, Applegate wrote a chillingly precise internal memo titled DC-10 Cargo Door Latch System. He wasn't suggesting minor improvements, he was sounding a 5-alarm fire. He argued that the minor fixes being proposed were just band-aids on a fundamentally unsafe design. He pointed out that this exact failure, a door blowing off and collapsing the floor, had already happened during a ground pressure test in 1970, proving the plane had an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure. Then he laid out the future in stark, terrifying detail. He predicted that a cargo door would inevitably come open in flight, the cabin floor would collapse, and the flight controls running through it would be severed, rendering the plane uncontrollable. His conclusion was a prophecy of doom. It seems to me inevitable that, in the 20 years of service ahead for the DC-10, cargo doors will come open. I would expect this to usually result in the loss of the aircraft. Applegate had done his job. He had warned his superiors in the clearest possible terms, but the corporate response was not to fix the plane. It was to bury the memo. Convair was bound by a contract with McDonnell Douglas. If they raised major design concerns after production had started, Convair, not McDonnell Douglas, could be held financially liable for the incredibly expensive fleet-wide fixes. Faced with this choice, Convair's management chose silence. The Applegate memo was filed away. It would only surface 2 years later during the lawsuits following the Paris crash, where it became the smoking gun, irrefutable proof that the disaster was not just foreseeable but had been explicitly predicted by the people building the plane. The survival of American Airlines Flight 96 should have triggered an immediate public and mandatory order from the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) to fix every DC-10. This order, called an Airworthiness Directive, is the FAA's most powerful tool for correcting an unsafe condition. But a public AD would have been a commercial catastrophe for McDonnell Douglas, which was locked in a bitter sales war with the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. An AD would have been a flashing neon sign advertising a major flaw in their new jet, handing a massive advantage to their rival. So instead of a public mandate, the FAA and McDonnell Douglas made a private gentleman's agreement. The manufacturer would issue a series of non-mandatory service bulletins to airlines, suggesting they make minor modifications to the door. This backroom deal is a textbook example of regulatory capture, where the government agency meant to protect the public instead protects the financial interests of the industry it's supposed to be policing. The FAA's conflicting mission to ensure safety while also promoting the airline industry was resolved in favor of corporate profits. The fixes themselves were a joke. They involved things like adding a small support plate to the weak handle linkage and installing a tiny viewing window so a baggage handler could try to visually confirm if the pins were locked. Crucially, the deal completely ignored the NTSB's most important recommendation: installing pressure relief vents in the cabin floor. They were patching the faulty latch, but doing nothing about the structural flaw that made the latch failure fatal. This negligence was compounded by a complete breakdown in quality control. The specific aircraft that would become Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was on the production line when these service bulletins were issued. McDonnell Douglas's own records show that they signed off on completing the modifications, including installing the support plate. But when investigators recovered the cargo door from a field in France 2 years later, they found the plate had never been installed. The paperwork was either a catastrophic error or an outright lie. With a known flaw, a buried warning, and a secret deal, the stage was set. It was no longer a question of if the disaster would happen, but when and where. On March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 was at Paris-Orly Airport, on its way from Istanbul to London. A strike at British Airways meant the flight was packed with last-minute passengers, filling the wide-body jet with 346 people. At around 12:30 p.m., the DC-10 took off and began to climb. 10 minutes later, as the jet climbed through 11,000 feet, the prophecy of the Applegate memo came true. The aft cargo door blew off with explosive force. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sudden roar of decompression. "The fuselage has burst," the co-pilot yelled. On the ground, air traffic controllers watched in horror as the plane's radar blip split in two before the main signature began a terrifying, uncontrolled descent. The unvented cabin floor collapsed instantly, just as predicted. The flight control cables running through it were sliced to ribbons. In the cockpit, the pilots were now just passengers. They had no control over the elevators, the rudder, or the tail engine. The aircraft was an unguided missile. Through the gaping hole in the fuselage, an entire row of seats, with 6 passengers still strapped in, was ripped out of the plane, their bodies later found miles from the main crash site. The DC-10 pitched violently into a 20-degree nosedive, accelerating towards 500 miles per hour. From the moment the door failed to the moment of impact, only 77 seconds passed. At 12:41 p.m., Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest northeast of Paris. The impact was so catastrophic that the aircraft disintegrated into tens of thousands of fragments, making the recovery and identification of the victims a nightmarish task. There were no survivors. The gentleman's agreement had been paid for in full, with 346 lives. The crash in the Ermenonville forest sparked the public reckoning that McDonnell Douglas and the FAA had worked so hard to avoid. The French Investigation Bureau, the BEA, quickly identified the cause. The detached cargo door was the smoking gun. The final report blamed the disaster on the door's flawed design. McDonnell Douglas's initial attempt to blame the Algerian baggage handler at Orly collapsed under the mountain of evidence, especially since the warning labels on the door were printed only in English and Turkish, languages the handler couldn't read. The crash triggered one of the largest civil lawsuits in history, and McDonnell Douglas ultimately paid out millions in settlements. The FAA was finally forced to act, issuing the comprehensive airworthiness directive that should have come 2 years earlier. This not only mandated a complete rework of the door system on every DC-10, but also led to the rewriting of federal aviation regulations, imposing stricter standards for floor venting and fuselage integrity on all future aircraft designs. The DC-10 disaster literally changed the rulebook for building planes. But for the DC-10, it was too late. The damage to its reputation was permanent. Nicknamed the Death Cruiser by the media, public fear of the aircraft crippled its sales. McDonnell Douglas had won the short-term financial battle in 1972 by avoiding a recall, but they lost the war for the market and public trust. The chilling parallels to the Boeing 737 MAX disasters 45 years later prove that these lessons are never permanently learned. In that case, a flawed software system, MCAS, was concealed from pilots, and lax regulatory oversight by the FAA was again a key factor in 2 crashes that eliminated 346 people. The exact same number as Flight 981. What do you think? Has the aviation industry struck the right balance between corporate profit and the safety of passengers? Let us know in the comments and dive into our next insane video.